People who need to hide their behavior often accuse other people of control long before any real control exists. It is one of the cheapest and most effective reversals in modern relationships. If they can make your questions look oppressive, they no longer have to answer them honestly. If they can make your concerns sound invasive, then their secrecy begins to look like self-protection rather than deception. That is how a lot of betrayal survives in educated marriages. It doesn't survive by convincing you that nothing is wrong. It survives by convincing you that noticing what is wrong is itself the offense. And if you are a calm man, a careful man, a man reluctant to force a room into ugliness before the facts deserve it, that trick can work on you much longer than it should. It worked on me. For most of my adult life, I believed restraint would explain itself. I thought if a man stayed steady, asked direct questions without cruelty, and handled responsibility without needing applause, then the people closest to him would understand the difference between seriousness and domination. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually makes it more dangerous. I believed that because I was not emotionally chaotic, I was therefore difficult to manipulate through emotional language. In reality, quiet men are often the easiest people to manipulate once someone learns which moral accusation will make them hesitate. If you call an angry man angry, he may not care. If you call a conscientious man controlling, he often stops and re-examines himself long enough for the liar to move another 10 feet undercover. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and until a little over a year ago I had been married for 17 years to a woman named Lauren. We lived outside Minneapolis in a neighborhood built for the American fantasy of settled adulthood. Wide streets, good schools, landscaped front lawns, expensive windows, families who knew one another just well enough to borrow ladders and gossip responsibly. We had one daughter in college and a son in his sophomore year of high school. I worked in commercial operations for a medical equipment distributor, which meant contracts, schedules, logistics, margin pressure, contingency planning, and the quiet administrative intelligence required to keep large systems from embarrassing the confident people who like to pretend their success is entirely strategic. I trusted that kind of work because it punished fantasy eventually. If something was weak, it broke. If a cost existed, it matured. If someone delayed reality long enough, reality still arrived with paperwork. At home, I gave fantasy more room than it deserved. Lauren worked in donor communications for a museum foundation. She was articulate, socially quick, emotionally fluent, and very good at turning other people's attention into an environment she could breathe in. When we first met, I admired that. I was more deliberate, more internally paced, less interested in social atmosphere for its own sake. She made life feel brighter, or at least less procedural. I brought structure. She brought motion. That was the story we told ourselves, and for a long time I think it was true enough to count. I do not want to cheapen the early marriage by pretending it had always been false. It wasn't. There was love there. Real love. There had been years of tenderness, private loyalty, shared humor, and the kind of practical devotion that matters much more than romantic intensity once enough life has happened to both people. We survived my father's death, her sister's divorce, one frightening health scare with our son, and the ordinary corrosion of sleep, money, deadlines, and aging parents that turns marriage into something much heavier than sentiment. That matters because betrayal is not most painful when it destroys illusion. It is most painful when it rearranges your understanding of something that had once genuinely deserved trust. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should say something that does not make me look especially wise. I took too much pride in being dependable. Not outwardly. I'm not that kind of man. But inwardly, yes. I liked being the one who remembered things, anticipated things, solved things before they became emergencies. I handled the mortgage, the insurance, the college contributions, the tax folders, the plumbing calls, the contractor schedules, the retirement allocations, the passwords, the emergency fund, the 1,000 quiet mechanics of adult life. I did it because I was good at it and because someone had to. But if you do that long enough, you start to believe usefulness protects you from being fundamentally misunderstood. It doesn't. In fact, it can make misunderstanding easier. People begin relating to the outcome of your discipline as if it were simply the natural shape of the world. Lauren used to call me solid. In the beginning, that sounded affectionate. Later, it sounded like a category. Solid became predictable. Predictable became emotionally safe in an unflattering way. Safe became hard to surprise, hard to unsettle, maybe even hard to admire if one's appetite for admiration had grown larger than one's capacity for gratitude. I did not see that progression clearly while it was happening. Most husbands don't. We hear the same words spoken in slightly different tones and think we are still inside the same meaning. The first serious change in our marriage was not another man. It was accusation. Lauren began calling me controlling in moments that, at first, did not seem large enough to deserve analysis. If I asked whether she'd be home for dinner because our son wanted both of us there before a game, I was trying to control the evening. If I asked why a donor dinner had somehow ended after midnight on a Tuesday, I was monitoring her. If I pointed out that a hotel bar charge on the joint card did not line up with the work event location she had described, I was making normal adult freedom sound like criminal evidence. That last line stayed with me, not because it was persuasive, but because it was so precisely designed to trigger my self-doubt. That is the power of certain accusations. They are not meant to be true. They are meant to make a conscientious person stop moving. I should have recognized sooner that her language had changed because her moral position had changed. Instead, I kept trying to behave fairly. I did not want to become the husband who overreacted to every logistical inconsistency. I did not want to become one more man using concern as an excuse for surveillance. I still believed there was a meaningful difference between marriage and suspicion, and that if I crossed too quickly into suspicion, I would be degrading something that deserved better. Looking back, I can say with some embarrassment that my moral caution became one of the tools protecting her lie. There was another man, eventually visible enough to name. His name was Ethan. He was a development consultant attached to a capital campaign the museum was preparing to launch. I met him once at a donor reception. Mid-40s, probably. Polished in the professional way that communicates confidence without requiring originality. Good posture. Calibrated eye contact. The kind of man who listens exactly long enough to make women feel as though their words have landed in better soil than they usually do. Lauren described him first as a little full of himself, which in hindsight was its own kind of warning. People often introduce danger by pretending to criticize it. It lets them get emotionally close while maintaining moral distance in the story they tell at home. I noticed the frequency of the name before I noticed its emotional gravity. Ethan thought the board chair was weak. Ethan actually understood donor psychology. Ethan knew how to read ambition without flattering it, which is exactly the sort of sentence Lauren would only say about men she had started assigning symbolic meaning to. Still, frequency is not proof. That's the problem. Adults rarely walk into betrayal through doors labeled clearly enough for decent people to feel justified in acting early. Instead, the house changes first. Lauren became more inconsistent. Some nights she was warm, almost overly attentive, asking about my work with a brightness that felt compensatory rather than natural. Other nights she seemed to exist just outside the perimeter of the marriage while technically occupying the same rooms. Her phone had a different emotional weight in her hand. She smiled at it in private, flattened that smile when I entered, and started carrying it upstairs even during moments she used to leave it on the counter without thought. Nothing dramatic. That is the point. Betrayal becomes most efficient when it hides inside ordinary variation. Then came the reversal pattern. The more I noticed, the more she accused. Not with theatrical anger. With therapeutic language. She said she felt scrutinized. She said marriage did not mean reporting her movements. She said I was trying to manage her reality whenever I asked for specifics that used to come naturally. That phrase, manage her reality, irritated me so much I remember the room where she said it. We were standing in the mudroom. She had just come back from a campaign dinner that somehow required no photos, no names of attendees she hadn't already mentioned vaguely, and a rideshare drop-off 2 blocks from our house instead of the driveway. I asked why. She said, maybe because I didn't want to be interrogated the second I got home. I said, I asked why you got out 2 blocks away. She looked at me as if I had proven something awful and said, This is exactly what I mean. You don't ask questions because you care. You ask questions because you need control. That line troubled me for weeks. Not because I thought it was fully true. Because I am disciplined enough to examine whether it might be partly true. That is the danger of accusing a serious person of a moral flaw adjacent to his actual strengths. I do like knowing what is happening. I do believe responsibility includes clarity. I do distrust vagueness around money, movement, and promises. She took traits that made me a stable husband and carefully rebranded them as evidence of spiritual limitation. That is not only manipulative. It is strategically manipulative. If I had been a louder, more reckless man, the accusation would have bounced off. But I am not. I am the kind of man who will lose sleep before becoming unjust. Lauren knew that. She understood my character well enough to know what vocabulary would make me hesitate. That is one of the uglier truths I had to accept later. She was not simply lying to me. She was using my conscience against me. The moment I should have understood everything came through our son. He was 15 at the time, at that age where children are old enough to sense adult dishonesty but still young enough to describe it in offhand ways that cut deeper than analysis. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage looking for an old extension cord when he came in to grab his cleats and said, almost casually, "Mom smiles at her phone more when you're not around." I remember turning and saying, "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Nothing. It's just weird. She looks different." Then he left. That sentence did more damage than any hotel receipt could have in that moment. Because children do not speak in accusation the way adults do. They speak in atmospheric truths. He wasn't telling me there was an affair. He was telling me the emotional geometry of the house had changed enough that even he could feel it. That meant the lie was no longer private. It had become climate. I did not ask him anything else. Children are not evidence-gathering tools for adult failure. But I carried that sentence with me, and for the first time I stopped trying to protect the softer explanation. I began paying attention the way I would at work once a system's official story no longer matched the data. Quietly. Systematically. Not obsessively. I checked the account statements without announcing it. I reviewed the shared calendar more carefully. I noticed which events had receipts and which had only vague narratives. I noticed the same restaurant appearing more than once on nights Ethan's name had happened to arise earlier in the week. I noticed a boutique hotel lounge charge miles away from any museum property. I noticed that one of the museum parking validations she forwarded into our tax folder had a timestamp that made her working late story impossible. And then I found the second relationship. Not metaphorically. Practically. Lauren used a shared cloud drive for tax files and school documents because I handled most of that. One evening, while looking for a 1099 attachment, I opened a folder mislabeled Campaign Notes. Inside was a PDF itinerary for a donor retreat, but attached to it, stored carelessly or arrogantly enough to end everything, was a saved reservation confirmation for a 2-night stay under Lauren's name at a lakeside inn I knew our family had never visited, linked to a couple's package that made no sense in any professional context. Ethan's email signature sat at the top of the forwarded thread. I sat there for a long time. Not because I didn't understand what it meant. Because I understood it too clearly, and clarity, when it finally arrives after months of resisted suspicion, often feels quieter than anger. More like a room in you going permanently still. I did not confront her immediately. That mattered. If I had, she would have had access to my shock, and shock is one of the easiest emotional states for skilled liars to reframe. They cry, narrow, soften, redirect, accuse, and turn the first confrontation into the place where the betrayed spouse accidentally hands back control. I didn't want that. Not anymore. I wanted structure. I wanted the full sequence. I wanted to understand not just that she had another relationship, but how long she had been making my questions into the problem while building a second emotional life in parallel. So I stayed silent. This time, my silence was not confusion. It was leverage. I met with an attorney named Claire Donnelly. Late 60s, exact, unsentimental, and entirely unimpressed by the kind of emotional sophistication people use to disguise old selfishness. I told her about the affair, the accusations of control, the financial overlap, the pattern, the child noticing something was wrong. Claire listened and then said something that clarified the whole architecture of the marriage for me. She needed you morally unstable enough to defend yourself, she said. That would have kept you from seeing what she was really doing. That was exactly right. Because once I looked at the pattern without apologizing for noticing it, everything reassembled. Lauren had not merely hidden a second relationship. She had built that relationship under the cover of accusing me of control whenever I got close enough to reality to threaten it. She needed my questions to look oppressive because otherwise her answers would have to look dishonest. That is not ordinary cheating. That is moral inversion. I changed after that, and she noticed. Not dramatically. I still made dinner. Still showed up for our son. Still paid the bills and kept the house from becoming a war zone. But I stopped doing the emotional labor that had made her accusation work. I stopped asking where she was. Stopped seeking explanations. Stopped trying to rescue the atmosphere after she sharpened it. Stopped volunteering my own feelings into a room where they would only be used against me. I remained calm. But my calm no longer served her. One evening she said, "You've gotten really passive-aggressive lately." I said, "No. I've just stopped helping you confuse scrutiny with consequence." That landed. Not because it was loud. Because for the first time, I had used accurate language without asking her permission to do so. The turning point came on a Thursday night. She came home around 10, set her bag on the table, and found me sitting with a folder in front of me. No anger. No dramatic lighting. Just the house finally honest. She looked at the folder and said, "What now?" I said, "The part where you stop calling me controlling because you no longer need the cover." She froze, then tried the same move that had worked for months. Offense first. "I'm not doing this if you're going to ambush me." I said, "You already did this. I'm just finished pretending the accusation still works." Then I opened the folder and showed her the reservation, the receipts, the account flows, the timeline, the draft petition. Her face changed in stages. Recognition. Calculation. Then something very close to fear. Not fear of me. Fear of losing narrative control. Because that is what my silence had taken from her. She thought I was the sort of husband who needed each truth delivered through her interpretation before it could become real. She thought if she kept me morally off balance, kept me wondering whether I was too rigid, too watchful, too controlling, then she would continue owning the pace at which the truth entered our life. She was wrong. The first thing she said was not, "I'm sorry." It was, "You went through my things?" There is something almost dull about how predictable that move becomes once you've seen it enough. The method becomes the offense because the underlying act can no longer be morally defended. I said, "No. I finally stopped protecting your version of reality." Then came the sequence. It wasn't what I thought. It began emotionally. She had felt unseen for years. Ethan understood parts of her that I had reduced to routine. My steadiness had become suffocating. She had needed somewhere to feel real again. All the usual language. Some of it probably true in the smallest emotional fragments. Betrayers often tell partial truths about their unhappiness. What matters is what they build on top of those truths and what they feel entitled to call it. Then she said the line that ended the marriage for me more decisively than the affair itself. "I didn't tell you because you would have tried to control the outcome." That was the moment the truth was fully revealed. Not that there was another man. Not that she had lied. The deeper truth was that she genuinely believed honesty had become optional because, in her mind, I had lost the right to reality by being too serious, too structured, too demanding of clarity. In other words, she had assigned herself moral authority over truth itself. That is what made the accusation of control so obscene in hindsight. She was not defending her autonomy. She was monopolizing the terms of the marriage while pretending my questions were the threat. I said, "No. You hid it because truth would have made your second relationship impossible to call freedom." That was the cleanest sentence I said in the entire collapse. The divorce itself was not dramatic. It was administrative, painful, careful, and ordinary in the way serious adult endings often are. Accounts, schedules, property. Our son learning too early that adults often lie most smoothly when they're trying to sound emotionally evolved. Ethan disappeared quickly once the affair lost its flattering secrecy and required actual life from him. That did not surprise me. Secondary relationships often look profound only because they are sheltered from ordinary consequence. What stayed with me much longer was the accusation. Controlling. I thought about that word often. About how effectively it had delayed my clarity. About how many decent men spend months or years questioning their own seriousness because a dishonest partner discovered exactly which moral language would make them hesitate. That is why I no longer hear certain relationship vocabulary innocently. Not because the words themselves are meaningless. Because some people use them as tools. Control, safety, space, growth, honesty, freedom. All real words. All useful covers when the speaker needs your conscience more than your consent. A year later, Lauren said something to me outside our son's school fundraiser, after we'd both signed a form for his summer program. I really did think you'd become much uglier when you found out. I looked at her and answered with more honesty than cruelty. That was the whole mistake. You thought I needed confusion to stay decent. She looked at me for a long moment and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The lie had already ended. The accusation had lost its shelter. The truth no longer needed her language to exist. If there is any message worth carrying from my story, it is this. When someone calls you controlling for asking ordinary, dignified questions inside a marriage, do not only ask whether the accusation is fair. Ask what the accusation is protecting. Sometimes it is fair. Many people do use concern as domination. But sometimes, and this is the uglier part, the accusation is a preemptive strike against reality. A way of making honesty feel abusive before it can expose the second life already being built in secret. That is what happened to me. My wife called me controlling while hiding a second relationship because she needed my conscience disoriented. She needed my questions to feel immoral so her deception could continue feeling justified. And the moment I stopped asking her to interpret what I was seeing, the whole structure collapsed. Not because I won. Because the truth no longer had to pass through the person betraying it.